Yeah, I won't talk here at the start and do you.
All right. Yeah, I feel like I feel like it's not the same input thing that I usually use, but I can't remember. I need to actually write it down. So like when I actually restart all of the OBS stuff that it, goes back to the normal ones. My
I've been
dogs.
doing it. I just keep post-its by my desk, and I've been doing it for like job stuff. But you could just probably take like notes or something
Yeah,
and
probably.
stick that on a wall.
And Lauren's not here right now, so the dog is with me and she is not having a good time.
Oh no.
So hopefully she doesn't bark while I have my mic on. The mic sound alright on the stream?
For you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. You ready to get started then?
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to episode 156 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're previewing the second minor of the Call of Duty League season. We have a single elimination online tournament coming up this weekend involving all 12 of the CDL teams. And if you've never been with us for a preview, I think these are some of the better shows that we do because we don't stick to the matches, obviously, because we're just entirely previewing. We're just talking about what we think might happen or what possibly could happen. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm all right. Get a little early afternoon show in instead of a later one tonight, and I'm able to do this without the annoying light on above me, and I got just natural sunlight in the room, so that's a little change of pace. But yeah, we got some decent matches. Only a single elim online tournament this time around, as opposed to a LAN or anything. But um, I thought the first minor tournament went pretty well, and I'm excited for the second one. And um, I just think I mentioned it last episode, but make sure you guys tune in, and any feedback you have, relay it to the league, because based on that community update they shared, they're listening to stuff around this minor, and it could potentially lead to more of these tournaments being implemented in future seasons if it's something the community also enjoys. So let your voices be heard while the league is allegedly listening.
Yeah, and who knows what might actually happen over the next. I don't know if they would add minors for the rest of the season, but I think maybe for next season to have all minors before like a major. So like, if there are 4 or 5 majors next season, 4 or 5 minors as well would be certainly, I think, a welcome change of pace. Of course, this will be the final minor of the season. There will be no minor but before Major 3 or Major 4. So this is kind of the last, I guess, big shot to get these CDL points in this kind of format. Obviously, matches are one thing, but you could have a really great weekend and pick up a ton of CDL points and really help yourself for later in the season. And the format is it's kind of similar to like a major. The major has 8 teams starting in the winners bracket and then 4 in the losers bracket. Here we don't have winners and losers bracket, but we have 4 teams starting off with a first round bye. The top 4 teams according to the CDL standings at the end of Major 1. So something we talked about on the last episode. The first few Major 2 qualifier matches have no bearing on the minor seeding. The minor was basically official. The bracket and everything was already set before the Major 2 qualifiers even began. So at the very top, we have Atlanta FaZe, the number 1 seed, and then LAT, Carolina, and Toronto. Those are the top 4 seeds, and so they all get first round buys and really only have to win 3 matches instead of 4 matches to win this tournament. And then, of course, you have the bottom 8 teams starting in the first round who, the 5 will play 12, so on and so forth. I think it's going to be a really fun tournament. It's also going to be a different way of doing things from the first minor, because the first minor was basically the return to play for all of these teams after an extended holiday break. They had about a month off for the holidays in December and January, and then the minor was the first thing that these teams played in coming back into CDL play. Now we've had we've had a few weeks break between Major 1 and the Major 2 qualifiers, but we've generally had kind of a consistent flow of matches over the past month or 2 months now. And now we get this minor, and we get to see what teams actually look like in this kind of format when they've practiced and they've had actual matches pretty recently. So let's start with, I think it's probably one of the more interesting first round matchups, simply because these teams, in terms of standings, are very close to each other, but they also seem like they're trending in different directions. And I'm talking about the Boston Breach and Vancouver Surge. The Surge obviously are in a really good spot, at least from what we've seen over the last 2 weeks. Bringing in Neptune has reinvigorated this roster, or I don't even know if you could say reinvigorate, because it wasn't a roster that seemed incredibly invigorated to start the year. They seemed pretty stuck in the mud after Major 1. They make this change, and they have pretty much become I don't know if contender would be the right word. I think that's a little too strong, but they've certainly been a team that can, it seems, beat any other team on any given day, which is not something you can say about every single CDL team. And they've proven that they are a force to be reckoned with. Obviously, Boston is in a different spot now. Not necessarily on a losing streak, I don't think, but they are not as competitive as they were during the Major 1 qualifiers, at least consistently. We'll see what happens after the minor, or maybe they make a roster change at some point. But what do you think about this matchup between Vancouver and Boston?
Yeah, I think you set it up pretty nicely here. Vancouver's looking like one of the better teams since picking up Neptune, and Boston haven't been playing as well this time around as opposed to the last set of qualifiers. But I think, like, keeping that in mind, I getting a little ahead of ourselves prediction wise here, but I've been pretty vocal about not being on the Boston train as much as you, so I think it shouldn't surprise any of our listeners. I'm picking Vancouver for this one. And if that is what happens, I'm really excited for the second round matchup. I mean, just to play devil's advocate, if Boston does beat Vancouver, it'd be Vancouver's first loss with Neptune, and I just based on how they play, I don't really see that happening. And that would set up the second round matchup against FaZe, which I'm pretty sure we've seen that twice in the qualifier and at Major 1, and I'm pretty sure both of them were 3-0s for FaZe. So even if Boston does get by Vancouver, it doesn't really set up a necessarily super hype second round matchup. But if Vancouver takes care of business against Boston, it sets us up with that rematch against Atlanta, where Vancouver in their first match with Neptune were able to beat Atlanta FaZe, and basically not many people saw that coming. Both of us didn't see it coming. I would be shocked if many people expected it. And that, FaZe will be looking for revenge in that matchup. And at the same time, Vancouver would be looking to prove like that wasn't a fluke, or that they are able to consistently hang with the best of the best. So that's what I'm looking for here. There are times where matches happen, and I'm pretty indifferent towards who I want to win in the grand scheme of things. But this is one where I really want Vancouver to win against Boston just because I really want to see that rematch with FaZe.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If we just want to see more competitive matches, and we haven't seen a single competitive match between Boston and Atlanta yet. Like you mentioned, Boston's only been swept 3 times this season. Twice it's been by Atlanta FaZe, and those have been, not like those really close sweeps where you're like, all right, like each of these maps could have went either way. No, it was pretty clear that Atlanta was the better team in those matchups. And on the other hand, like you mentioned, Vancouver and Atlanta have only played once this season, and it was at the beginning of these qualifiers, and it was the kind of the start of this momentum we've been talking about with Vancouver, where they beat Atlanta, and then they move on. They beat C9, they beat LAG. Obviously, the competition after that has not been as strong. But it was a 3-1 win for Vancouver, so they didn't even need to go to Game 5 to beat FaZe, who I believe are on like a 12-match win streak heading into that match. So it's certainly a matchup that I would be down to see. But Boston kind of, I don't know, like needs a win. I think it's too, it's not as urgent as that, but it certainly would be nice for Boston to get a win, get some extra CDL points, and just get like a little bit of boost of momentum or confidence back in themselves by beating Vancouver for, giving Vancouver their first loss with Neptune would be a pretty big achievement for Boston. But yeah, I don't see it happening. I think it's probably going to be the Surge, and we'll see that matchup between Vancouver and Atlanta in the second round. Next up in the bracket, just going to go right down the bracket. This is, like I said, probably Vancouver and Boston is a very highly anticipated matchup.
I thought we were starting with this one, to be honest.
No, I was thinking like more competitive or storylines, but man, this has the potential to, I don't know, like the domino effect, you could call it. We talked about it on the last episode. Optic Texas 0-3 in the Major 2 qualifiers, 0-9 in map count. They have not won a match since Pred has returned to the lineup. There's been so much talk about the play of Kenny and his performances over the past few weeks, and now they try to get back on the right track. And we also talked about in the last episode how Vegas is the perfect get-right team. They are abysmal. They've won, I think, 5 or 6 maps all season long. They have not even forced a Game 5 yet. Obviously, they're winless on the season. And Optic and Vegas are now meeting in the first round of this minor. This is the perfect time for Optic to just, like I just said about Boston, about getting some momentum, getting some confidence. Optic needs that way more than Boston does, and Vegas is the perfect opponent to do that. I obviously, I'm going to pick Optic. I'm sure you're picking Optic. But, man, this has the potential to pretty much change the entire CDL if Vegas is able to win this match.
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, it starts right out of the gate too. If you date it back to the end of Major 1, which was obviously with Hook, Optic have lost 12 straight maps. I don't think it's really, it is what it is because it's the team, but with Pred in particular, they've lost 3 straight series, 9 straight maps. So map 1 against Vegas, they've lost 9 maps in a row. Overall, Vegas Falcons have lost 19 hard points this year. 0-19 in hard point, I believe, is what the streak is at. So with map 1 of this series, we either get Optic losing their 10th consecutive map and giving Vegas their first hard point win ever, or Optic getting back on track, winning their first map with Pred back in the roster, and Vegas losing their 20th straight hard point to start the season. So, I mean, it starts off with a bang. And, just to throw it out there, again, like you said, I think Optic has to win this match. If they lose this match overall, like you did, literally could shake up the entire CDL with the ramifications of a loss. But, I lost my train of thought. Damn it.
I mean,
I was oh no. I remember. I was gonna say just to, obviously we know Vegas has struggled in hardpoint overall, but the one uh, instance where it looked like something could go their way was that map on Vault Hardpoint where Xnid dropped 52 kills, and that was against Optic. And X and Optic were able to make the comeback and win the map despite that historic performance from Xnid. And Xnid hasn't played very well statistically, really, with this most recent iteration of the Falcons roster. So I'm not saying I expect that again, but it's worth mentioning that Vegas has at least been quote unquote somewhat competitive in hardpoint against Optic. Not that I still don't think you know there was really ever any genuine worry during that map. Maybe there was slightly, just because like, holy shit, this guy's dropping a ton of kills. But like, they were down, Optic was down a bunch, and they were able to make a comeback despite that performance from Xnid. So like, even you got a guy dropping over 50 kills and Vegas can't win a hard point. Like, if he doesn't do that, then it shouldn't even be close in many regards. But regardless, yeah, I think starting with that first map, that's really going to tell us a lot of what we expect the rest of the way, because Vegas have looked, saying Vegas have looked their most competitive in search and destroy. Like, it's not like they are leaps and bounds better in search than they are in hardpoint. I mean, I guess they kind of are to some extent, but it's not like they're just a really really good S&D team and a really really bad hardpoint team. They're like an okay search team and a really really bad hardpoint team and respawn team. So if Vegas is able to make something happen in the search, get some doubt in the back of the Optic mind, then like who knows what happens. But I mean, at worst, I see a 3-1 win here from Optic, where Optic win the respawns and Vegas takes the search. But like, that's like just kind of out there. Like, I feel like if Optics just got too much talent, if they're able to put in the work and the talent and get the mindset going before this matchup, they should be able to take a 3-0 here. And it's hard because we just haven't seen that. And this is really, like you said, it's their get right match. They have the opportunity here, but those get right matches, if you go in with the wrong mindset, or you go in thinking it's going to be a walk in a park and the other team catches you slipping, like we saw it earlier this season. Obviously there was some other stuff going on with Pred behind the scenes, but first match of the season for Optic when they played Boston, like that was at that time the number one defending champs from COD champs versus the last place team from the previous season, and Boston were able to make an upset happen there. So it's happened to Optic before as early as this season. I don't expect it to happen here, but who knows?
The most similar scenario that I can think of is last season, going into Major 4. And obviously, we've talked about this several times on the podcast, how Optic wins champs, but before that, they completely fall apart at the end of the season. I think they were the second seed in the CDL, if I'm not mistaken, going into the Major 4 qualifiers. We thought like they could get the first seed depending on like how well they do versus FaZe and all that. And then I think they went like 1-5 or something like that in the qualifiers. They just completely bomb out. And obviously they get eliminated first round in Major 4. But in those Major 4 qualifiers, Optic was on this losing streak of like, okay, like they're falling apart for whatever reason. And they played the Boston Breach. And Boston at that time had a 15-match losing streak heading into that match. They had not won, I believe, in 3 months. It had been over 3 months for the Boston Breach to have won a CDL match. And they go into that match. Also, I should add, Boston had lost. They had been swept 4 consecutive times before they went into their match with Optic. So they had, again, 15-match losing streak, been swept 4 straight times. They were by far the worst CDL team. They were the second worst CDL team in history. And they go in and they beat Optic Texas. Optic, of course, was going through their own stuff. They were, having their turmoil before champs. But at the same time, like, we're in a similar situation. I don't think it's nearly as dire because when it's at the end of the season, there's a lot of like concern whether that team can get right and they can find a way to win. Obviously, Optic did that, but there was certainly more concern there than there is now, just considering the timing of when this is happening. But I think there are similarities. Obviously, there are differences as well. Vegas is much, much worse than the Boston Breach last season. And like that is saying a lot because Boston, like I said, second worst team in Call of Duty League history, only second to the Paris Legion, who won, I believe, 2 matches in a season. Boston won 6 last year. Vegas is on pace right now to win 0 and to win 15 maps total this year. But so there are differences. I don't think that this is going to be a repeat of that, but I do think that the similarities are pretty weird in that it's actually happened to Optic just last season, where they lost to a team that they certainly shouldn't have lost to, even at their worst. But this is, like we said, this is Optic's get right match. Like this is the opportunity for them to, even if they just lose in the second round, because they don't have an easy second round matchup by any means. But even this win could just help them see a win go on the board, kind of take a little bit of pressure off of them. But certainly a loss is kind of catastrophic for this team. A roster change would almost assuredly come. I would say Kenny is probably on the chopping block at that point. Who knows if Pred gets cut? Like I have no idea what the limit is for Optic if they lose this match.
I do think, like looking ahead, like you said though, that not even from a seeding perspective, but you have to think that Toronto, if Optic beat Vegas, is the most favorable matchup for Optic in the second round, just because we saw Carolina sweep them in their last match, right? They lost. Have they played? They played LAT at the start of these qualifiers, I think, right? Or am I mixing that up? No, that was FaZe and
No,
Optic at the start.
LAT and Toronto just played, I'm pretty sure.
No, I'm talking about Optic playing the other teams. Optic played Atlanta at the start of these qualifiers, and it was a 3-0. So I can't remember that. We've had the HBR Classic this year, I feel like, but maybe that was in the minor one.
I'll look it up real quick. I'm on Breaking Point.
But regardless, I think just the way Toronto has been playing of late, like that's got to be the most favorable second round matchup for Optic if they beat Vegas. They literally just lost to Carolina. They've lost to Atlanta during this current spree, and LAT have looked really strong lately. So I think that could be the road that helps spark something for Optic. But even if they do, you in theory then have to play Atlanta or potentially Vancouver, having beat Atlanta twice, and I guess that would be an interesting matchup. And if that happens, Vancouver versus Optic, then Optic has a real shot to make the finals here. But either way, it's not going to be easy sledding for Optic, and just based on their play, we're going to have to see how they show up in their first match before we start getting too far ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, so Optic being matched up with Carolina or Atlanta would probably be a bad matchup for them. Simply, I think they're combined 0-4 against those two teams. Carolina, they're 0-3 against, and then I believe they're just 0-1 against FaZe. They've only played them, and that was like you said, the first match of these major two qualifiers. Against Toronto, they won 3-1 in the major one qualifiers. That was obviously the last qualifying match because that determined the number 1 seed for major one, and that is the only time they played them. So we haven't seen these two teams face off, and it's been a month from today that they played each other. But who knows? That's a different team, the different Optic, maybe a different Toronto as well. Like it's quite literally a different Optic because that was Hook's last online match with Optic. But Toronto doesn't seem like they're in the same space. Optic is certainly not. But yeah, there's a lot to. I think anybody who is a Call of Duty esports fan should tune in for the Optic Vegas match, even if it is anticlimactic and Optic just steamrolls them. That's a good thing for Optic fans. That's a good thing for maybe not like the entertainment level, because Vegas beating Optic would be one of the more that's like the the 0-16 Browns like beating like the Cowboys or something. Like that's just a big upset that should not happen ever. And I mean, it could happen. I think it's unlikely. You agree, like it's an unlikely scenario, but it's a fun thing to think about. Next up, Minnesota versus C9 New York. This is probably, I mean, all of these first round matchups have something to them. There's no like, okay, like what are we doing here? Minnesota, before last week in the qualifiers, was a team that we talked about like really highly. They've been on this kind of run. They'd shown that they're a pretty good team. They still have a lot of room to grow. I think they're still figuring things out, and C9 is certainly figuring things out or trying to, but they have looked better as of late. You never know with C9, and I think we've mentioned this on literally every single podcast so far this season, but C9 has the internet stuff that has kind of lingered around their online matches. I believe Minnesota is based in Dallas, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think they play out of Minnesota. But even then, like I don't really think it matters one way or the other where these teams are located anymore, because C9 has had these like pretty dominant showings against the East Coast teams. They beat Toronto very, very handily. They did the same to Boston. They've, like the thing that popped up at the beginning of the season was when they played Dallas-based teams, and like how the servers between like, I think it was whatever the server that they would prefer to have between Dallas and LA, I believe is like the Denver server, is not suitable, or the CDL doesn't use that, and that causes issues. So anything I think could be a problem for C9 online. So I don't even know how to take that into account or whether to do so. But it's a very interesting matchup because you have two teams that have I think they each have the ability to go pretty far in the minor. I think they could pull off upsets against a team like LAT. What do you think of Minnesota versus C9?
Yeah, I think this is the toughest match for me prediction wise. I really think you can make a solid case for picking either one of these teams, and I wouldn't, bat an eye at it. I think Minnesota's probably been the more consistent team um, in the, overall in this season. Um, but that's also factoring in more of Cloud9's struggles early in the season, most recently, um, as opposed, or and looking at this past week as the most recent sample size. Just Cloud9 looked pretty good, and Minnesota lost its first match. I
Carolina.
forget, to Carolina, yes, and then because I remember I was talking, they started 2-0, and then I was a little worried like maybe they're gonna fall back into that trend of major one qualifiers where they go 2-0 and then 0-2, but they had their free Vegas Falcons match, so they didn't go 0-2, so it's hard to take that into consideration and say like Minnesota's playing great, but they played well before this most recent week, and like I said, they've probably played the most maps of any team just because they've been in so many game fives. I think they have that going for them just in terms of search and destroy play and all that stuff. And really, Estriel's really stepped up in my eyes as just like a serious slaying threat. So like, if Nero or Geo is slipping, Estriel can pop off, and vice versa. Just insert one of those names if the other guys are slipping. And I think this Minnesota team can be formidable. So I'm going with Minnesota here, but I wouldn't be surprised if Cloud9 comes out and plays the way that they've looked in some of these qualifier maps recently. They could definitely take this series, and I do, like you said, I think either way that this is probably the qualifier matchup. I can't say it's the one I'm most excited for because I just think, naturally Optic versus Vegas, it's probably the most anticipated Vegas match of the year so far, just in terms of actually seeing what happens. But this Minnesota versus C9 should be the most competitive in theory, and I wouldn't be surprised if this one goes game 5.
Yeah, and they played twice this season, C9 in Minnesota. The first one was the Major 1 qualifiers. This is before Christmas, and that was C9's only win of those qualifiers. It was a 3-1 win on December 13th. And then the next time they played was at Major 1. Minnesota eliminated C9 from the Major. They won 3-1. So, They're tied in map count 4-4, tied in the map matches 1-1. It should be really entertaining. Minnesota has, I think, won 4 of their last 6 or something like that. And granted, they haven't had the toughest competition, or CNI, excuse me, has won 4 of their last 6. Minnesota has won, I believe, 5 of their last 7. But either way, like, these teams have been pretty hot as of late, and they have, like I said, the potential to, like, with their rosters, I would say C9 on paper would seem like the roster that would have the higher ceiling, but we haven't seen that yet from C9. We kind of have seen Minnesota's ceiling raise throughout the season, and
Yeah.
they seem like a much better team than they would appear on paper. But I mean, this is a big match for both of them. Neither team can afford to just give away CDL points, especially C9, with how hit or miss the online stuff has been for them.
And I think that's worth, noting as well. If you say that Cloud9 beat Minnesota in the Major 1 qualifiers, that would have means it fell in that second week of the qualifiers, I
Yes, I
believe,
believe
just
so.
because, like I said, Minnesota started 2-0, and then they went 0-2 after that, heading into the holiday break, and Cloud9 started 0-2 because they played Optic and LAT and kind of got ran with the online issues. So then if Cloud9 beat Minnesota, that in theory means they didn't really run into any online issues that time around. I don't remember seeing anything for that, especially because that was around the time where they were pretty vocal about the stuff going on. So that should mean, in theory, if everything's going right with the servers, this is about as fair of an online matchup as we get. Who knows what happens this time around, server wise and all that stuff. But let's just hope it's even playing field. We get a good matchup. So that does, if you're leaning Cloud9 prediction wise, that does bode well, just because with the online issues that Cloud9 has faced as a team, if this is one of the teams they have been able to beat online, it could be, you know, somewhat just, a little more favorable than some of the other matches these had that have had those issues.
Final match of the first round is the Miami Heretics versus LAG. LAG, obviously, we've talked about it ad nauseum now. They are in a really bad way, the second worst team in the CDL so far this season. They have not improved, seemingly, with Lunars in the lineup. Obviously, he was just there for 1 week, so that's pretty small sample size, all things considered. But they're still at the bottom of the CDL standings. Miami has been pretty good, I think. They're right in the middle of the pack in terms of the CDL standings. They have dealt with, obviously they dealt with like some roster stuff where they had to bring in players to, like with medals and stuff. But it seems like he's fine. He's back. Miami would appear to be favored here. I'm going to go with Miami. I think it's pretty hard to pick LAG at this point. And we should note that we're not entirely sure if LAG will have the same roster that they did last week, because we saw Crone's report that Priesta may be returning in place of Skies, and that would be a shakeup that would shake up probably the roles as well. And who knows exactly when that will go down, or if that will go down at all. But that is something to note. But I think either way, I would go with Miami, because I said on the last pod that I'm not a real big believer in Priesta being the solution one way or the other. And Lunars hasn't been, I guess, because people had hyped him up, and we even kind of bought into the hype of like maybe he is the guy to help turn around LAG. But I think right now it's just hard to pick it's hard to pick LAG in general. So I'm going to go with the Heretics.
Yeah, you kind of took the words out of my mouth there. I think we literally just saw this matchup last week for Lunar's debut, and we both picked LAG, fell for the hype of the honeymoon phase of the new Challengers player getting called up for his debut against a team that, in fairness, we didn't know for Miami if Metals or Super was going to play. And Miami 3-0'd LAG in that matchup. There is the caveat for this time around that we don't know if Priest or Skies is going to play. But either way, I can't really pick, LAG again. I'm not going to fall for it, and I'm going to go with Miami here. It will be interesting to see if Priesta comes into the roster for Skies. If that does, have an impact on, the team in a positive manner. We've kind of talked about all this at this point, last episode or 2 episodes now at this point. So not really worth repeating. We got to see more from this Gentlemate squad. It is worth noting. I mean, Lunars has played pretty well individually, statistically. It just hasn't translated to wins for the team. And again, it's only been 1 week for him as opposed to 2 for Neptune. So small sample size for both guys, in fairness. But excited to see more out of him. But this is, it's possible this is a one and done situation here if Miami takes care of business. It would be interesting, though, if Gentlemates are able to get a win here because, like I said, they just played a week ago, and it would be, this is assuming if they have the same roster with Skies and they win in the minor and they didn't win last week, then I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. But if they get the win here in the minor with Priesta and not with and they didn't previously with Skies, then it's kind of just like, yeah, I don't know what's going on. So we'll have to see. It would be a little interesting.
Yeah, and Miami is not a great S&D team, so maybe if there is some inconsistency, it will be in that. Obviously, we've talked about LAG is just like so bad at S&D that it's been such a detriment, and that's pretty much the reason that they're so far down. They're going to lose series regardless, but to be in second to last place, only above Vegas, that's pretty much a testament to just how bad they've been in search. And right now we haven't seen much improvement with Lunars, but again, it's only been 2 matches. So maybe another week of practice, maybe we'll certainly, and they can also prep for Miami again, see what didn't work last time. So who knows? But yeah, that's the first round. Let me just go through the bracket real quick. So again, Boston and Vancouver, they play the winner of that match plays Atlanta FaZe as they are the number 1 seed. Optic and Vegas, the winner plays Toronto. Minnesota and C9 play LAT, and the winner of Miami and LAG play Carolina. I would predict that. I mean, you can go either way, I guess, with Toronto and Optic. Like if Optic comes out and they look really good against Vegas, I could see myself convincing. I could convince myself, that Optic will beat Toronto. But I think in general, the chalk is probably the way to go for the minor. Atlanta's certainly going to be favored against Vancouver, even if Vancouver gets there again. But it will be an interesting matchup. I think Toronto will probably be favored against Optic. But I think that's probably the biggest toss-up. LAT will certainly be favored over Minnesota or C9, even though either one would probably be an entertaining matchup. And Carolina, of course, will be favored against Miami and LAG. That's probably the one that would seem like the most lopsided is probably the wrong word, but Carolina, like, in general is, like, I guess kind of consistent. I just think Miami and LAG are, like, 2 of the weaker teams, or, they don't seem like they can really surprise you as much as some of these other teams in the bracket. But yeah, I that's the way I'm going. That probably means that Carolina is the first one out from the top 4, and they get eliminated in the second round.
It is, Miami was the team that eliminated Carolina from Major 1. Carolina got 4th, Miami got 3rd, so not a huge difference there, but we have seen Miami beat Carolina, and Carolina, before this past week, they started 0-2, and we're sitting here talking like if they struggle against Minnesota and Optic in last week's matchups, like they could be 0-4. We're talking about roster changes, all that, but they were able to secure a big 2-0 week themselves to like avoid those discussions, at least from us for now. So I think in that sense, like Carolina isn't the safest bet. I think looking at the bracket, if it's Carolina versus Miami, I could see Miami beating them. I think Carolina is the better team, though. And even if Carolina wins that matchup, and then we just assume LAT is the other matchup, 2-3 there in the semifinals, LAT has owned that Carolina matchup so far. Pretty sure, like, most of the hard points have been 100-point clubs, and if not close to it. So I would expect, LAT, just the way the bracket looks right now, is a pretty safe bet to make the finals here. The top half of the bracket, though, I definitely think it's where it gets interesting. You say chalk. I mean, if Vancouver gets there to Atlanta, I wouldn't be surprised if Vancouver does it again, but that's going to be a super hype matchup if it happens. Um, because I think FaZe will want to be like, yeah, okay, you got us once, you're not going to catch us slipping again. And then even if FaZe does beat Vancouver, that 5-4 matchup between Optic and Toronto, I think that's the one that can really go either way. It's weird to say that with Optic sitting at 0-9, but like if they come out, get some confidence from the Vegas matchup, who knows what happens in the showdown with Toronto. So it'll be interesting. I think, you know, it's never the most fun to just say it's going to be chalk, but like if we get more of Draza versus Scrappy and we get Atlanta versus LA Thieves and another best of 7, I'm here for it. And I kind of think that's where, just looking at the bracket, that's probably where we're heading if everything plays out as we expect.
Yeah, and we should also note that Minor 1 did not go according to plan either. Obviously, Atlanta was in the first round. They were one of the, I think, bottom 4 teams, if I'm not mistaken, heading into that first minor. And they ran the table. They beat Miami, LAT, Minnesota, and then Carolina in the final. Carolina, I believe was Carolina looking bad like at the end, like before the holiday break or just after? I can't remember if like I know that.
No, they were undefeated heading into the holiday break.
Okay, so yeah, so Carolina kind of took care of business. They they beat C9. It was a game 5. They beat Optic, which is a game 5, and then they lost to Atlanta in the final. But the biggest surprises, I think, were LAT losing in their first matchup. They had a bye into the second round. Of course, they did play Atlanta, so you can say, well, they had to play what turned out to be the best team. And FaZe was kind of just getting started in their win streak. In Toronto, they lost to Minnesota in the first round. That was kind of like the first crack. Like them losing to Optic was not like some like, oh my God, look at Toronto. But them losing to Minnesota was literally their first loss, I believe, so far this CDL season. And that kind of started the cracks that began to form toward the end of those Major 1 qualifiers, and that extended into Major 1. And I guess have kind of continued on into these Major 2 qualifiers. So we'll see if Toronto can kind of figure things out from there. But yeah, I think it didn't go according to plan in Minor 1. It didn't go according to plan in Major 1 because obviously Optic was the number 1 seed, and they ended up getting knocked out, or they ended up getting losing in that first round when we thought like there's just no way that they're going to lose, but they did. And with it being single elimination, that adds another layer of unpredictability into it as well, because the best teams generally in these majors can find their way back to a top 4 placing just based on like, okay, they have to go through the losers bracket, they have to beat LAG, they have to beat Miami, et cetera, et cetera. Like those are teams that they probably can beat. But with how things are set up in the minor, you could be one and done. Like there's a real chance that Minnesota loses in that first round, which, with how they've played recently, I don't think people would say like, okay, like they're one of those bottom 4 teams in the CDL, but in a minor, they could be among those bottom 4 teams. And, I think it's interesting. LAG certainly could make a run as well because they've lost a lot of game 5s. If they're able to, if they're able to just get a little bit lucky, I guess, with the game 5s, and they really could go on a run and win 1 or 2, maybe even 3 matches. Who knows? Atlanta certainly didn't look like a team that was going to make a run until they did, and that now they're the best team, and everybody agrees that they're the team to beat so far this season. So I think it's a really interesting minor, taking in everything about this tournament. I hope to see more of them next year. I think this is a cool format. I don't know if players take them more seriously than matches. It feels like I think it's a competitive way to do things. I just like the tournament setup. I think players generally like the tournament setup more than just one-off matches. Like,
yeah,
I think you get invested, and I think the players also get invested in kind of the grind that is those 3 days. So I think it'll be a really fun tournament. Who are you predicting, or I can assume, but I don't want to assume. Who are you picking to win Minor 2?
Yeah, you got to go with Atlanta. But like I said, I'm hoping it'll be Atlanta versus LAT in the grand finals, just so we get as many of those draws over scrap showdowns as possible. And both at Major 1 went down to a Game 5 round 11 and a Game 7 round 11. So if we do get that showdown, it's very feasible that LAT could pull out the win, and that could be what sparks like an LAT run and heading into Major 2. Like that could be scary. So I'm excited. I hope that's just the showdown, and then we get a really good series in the finals. It is worth mentioning too, best of 7 finals for this minor as opposed to minor 1, which is best of 5 for the finals. Um, but yeah, I'll pick Atlanta as my winner.
I'll go with LAT. I think we need to be different because we picked the exact same matches in the first round of the minor as well. But also LAT, they have won. They beat every other team except FaZe in there. So FaZe has beaten them 3 straight times, I believe, and I think that's correct. Yes. So they beat them in the minor, and then they beat them twice in the major, including in the grand finals, which was a best of 7, which we could see again. And that was like a razor thin margin. I think we both can agree. FaZe came out on top, but I think it was they didn't win any hard points. Well, that was the deal, right? That FaZe lost the hard points, but then
Yeah.
they won the S&Ds and that kind of clutched up at the end. But that's about as close as 2 teams can get. I think there's a possibility that FaZe might not get to the grand final. Like you said, Vancouver plays them in the second round.
Yeah.
Vancouver has shown that they actually can beat FaZe pretty recently. Who knows if Optic shows up, and Optic is the team that we've expected them to be, even though they have not had a ton of success against FaZe over the last year. But who knows if that could change. But yeah, I'll go with LAT. They're an incredible team, and we would be really lucky to see LAT and FaZe play again in the grand finals. If we could get Optic versus FaZe in the semifinals, LAT versus Carolina, even if Carolina hasn't really performed great in those matches, I think that would be a pretty good way to have this minor go, and then we could get into the Major 2 qualifiers and finish that up, and then we'll be at Major 2 before we know it. Any dark horse? So I guess let's look at the bracket. So no FaZe. Outside of the top 5 teams, I would say, because I think everybody would think, okay, Atlanta, LAT, Carolina. If I don't include Toronto, you will pick Toronto, and if I don't include Optic, you'll pick Optic. So, outside of those top 5 teams, who's the most likely to win in your eyes?
I think, I think the bottom of the bracket is a little more lenient, and I just, I think that bodes well for LAT, so it's tougher to pick a dark horse there. Looking at the bottom of the bracket, I would probably go with Minnesota. We've seen them go on losers bracket runs. They went on a run at the previous minor to a top 4 placing, I believe. But I think it might be a little bit of a cop-out answer, but for overall, Vancouver Surge, they haven't lost with Neptune yet, so they could be in a position they get past Boston. Very tough matchup against FaZe, but they've already done it. So, I think overall I'd say Surge are the biggest dark horse to pull off the whole thing. But I guess looking at it from a bracket perspective, I'd say Surge or Rocker, either half of the bracket.
Yeah, that's a good pick. I think Minnesota would be pretty interesting because they'd have to get through C9, LAT, and probably Carolina to get to the grand finals, and then they're probably going to play FaZe or maybe Toronto or Optic. Like they're going to have to beat like the 3 top teams in the league to get there. So that's just a really tough bracket for them, but it's a pretty tough bracket for most of these teams, and I think that's pretty cool about the minors. Like you don't have, because of the winners and losers bracket, like you don't have to see these teams necessarily go against the best all the time. There have been instances, and quite a few of them, where one of the top 4 teams, they kind of skate by. Like they don't have to play FaZe or they don't have to play Optic. They might have to play them once, like later in the losers bracket, but a lot of times you can avoid these teams if you lose certain matches, and you just have to play Miami and LAG and so on and so forth. But in this, it's like it's all funneled into the same area. So you're going to have to beat these teams, or you're going to have to beat the teams that beat those teams. And I think it's a pretty cool setup, all things considered. Anything else on the minor before we get out of here? Obviously, it's coming up. I believe it starts on Friday, February 28th. So the first day's matches will just be the first round matches, and then I believe the second day will be like, whether they do like 3 of the. How do they do it? I think it's just the second round, and then like the third day might be the semifinals and finals on the same day, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. It's 4-4-3.
Okay, yeah. So if you are tuning in, I would very much encourage you to tune in to Optic in Vegas. I think that is the match of the weekend until it's not, until Optic steamrolls them. Anything else on Minder 2?
I just wanted to throw it back out there. I don't think we've said it in this episode, but you kind of like got me thinking about it when you were just talking about, the tournament versus, like those throwaway matches is the prizing and the points here. We've talked about it to some extent, but just to make sure we get it out there, it's a $20,000 winner take all prize pool. So even if you compare it to those quote unquote money matches or whatever they were in random
Bounty matches.
Yeah, we've talked about how much we thought those were not necessary or not great ideas. But that into this too. It's like there's $20,000 on the line. You split it 4 ways with your teammates. It's $5K each if you win 3 or 4 series of Call of Duty, so not a bad payday there. And for the points perspective, you get 30 CDL points for first place, 20 for second place, and then 10 points for third, fourth. So if you win your first round matchup and you lose your second round matchup, you're getting 0 points just as much as if you lost right away. And those points won't be used to seed for Meter 2. It's really, that's just in the grand scheme of things for champs aspirations and stuff. So a team like, just throwing out Cloud9, like didn't have a great Major 1 qualifier. This is a way for them to try and make up points if they're able to go on a run here. Those other top teams, like FaZe, LAT, it's more incentive for them to put a little bit more of a cushion in their place in the standings. And we've seen what FaZe have done in the past. And when they build up their CDL points, they're able to experiment more with their map pool and try and become a more well-rounded team on every single map. And that's always dangerous for the competition too. So a lot on the line, not as much as a major, but for a single elimination online tournament, there are more stakes than just like, seeding and just another regular online qualifier. So I'm excited for the action. I think the way the bracket shook out, like there's interesting matchups that could play out if things go as expected. But like you said earlier, something's going to happen that we didn't expect, and it'll make things a little more interesting too. And we'll be here to break it all down when that does happen after the minor.
Yeah, to illustrate how important these points are, FaZe right now, if they didn't pick up those 30 CDL points at Minor 1, would actually be in second place instead of first place in the league. LAT would be in first place. And LAT, the biggest difference is LAT didn't pick up any CDL points at Minor 1. And, Carolina, they had 20, which was kind of a big boost. They have a little bit of a cushion between them and Toronto as a result of that. And then, there are teams just down the line, like, getting top 4 is a pretty big accomplishment because it gives you something. Like, you didn't waste the weekend, essentially. If you don't get top 4, you don't get anything. Obviously, the money only goes to first place, but if you don't get top 4, you don't get any CDL points, and that's a big missed opportunity for a lot of these teams. But yeah, it should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. We'll break it all down on the next episode on Sunday. We'll talk about what happened at Minor 2, and we'll preview Major 2 qualifiers next Wednesday. We'll talk about that, and I believe we're not going to do a show next Sunday. Not obviously we'll do a show this coming Sunday and talk about the minor, but the following Sunday I don't believe we'll be doing a show. But we'll obviously keep you updated. We'll probably talk about it on the next 2 episodes as well. But we appreciate you guys tuning in and listening and watching. Please subscribe, follow, or just please just support the podcast if you're able to. We're on pretty much all the podcasting platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. We are also on YouTube. You can search up Ego Chall Podcast on YouTube, and you can also watch the live streams if you're interested. And if you missed the live stream and you still like the feel of a live stream versus the actual podcast, we have all of the live streams like cataloged on the YouTube channel as well. I don't know if people actually do that, but you could do that if you wanted to. So search up Ego Chall Podcast. We're, I believe, at 210 subscribers on YouTube now. You can also follow us on Twitch, and we're at Ego Chall Podcast on Twitch. And Bink is JBink with 2Ks on Twitch as well. He's like at 45 days streaming consecutively. He just woke up not that long ago, I don't think. So he's got plenty of time to continue the streak later on tonight. Make sure to subscribe, or not subscribe. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks and at Pres Byers. Podcast tours at Ego Chall Podcast. And like I said, next show will be Sunday, March 2nd. That will be at our regularly scheduled time of like late night. We'll do it after the matches, of course, on Sunday, probably like 8-9 o'clock p.m. Eastern. So if you want to tune in, you can do so then. But we appreciate you listening and watching. And Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all the support. Appreciate it. Like you said, hopefully this minor's a little more exciting than some of the, this past week of online qualifiers. We had 7 of 10 3-0s, so we're getting 10 matches here, right? So it's 11 matches. Hopefully we get some good storylines and some juicy stuff to talk about. Like I said, hopefully we get another Atlanta versus LAT showdown, because those are always hype. And like I said at the very start of the show, if you guys like the minor, if you don't like the minor, whatever feedback you have on that this new format for midseason stuff, make sure you let the CDL know. Leave comments on their channels and all that stuff. So if you do like it, we can continue to see these going forward, because that's what I definitely, we've talked about it on previous episodes, just like that 2K 5K vibe, like of online tournaments, breaks up the online matches. I'm a fan of seeing more of it. So if you guys are like me, think we should do this in 2026 and beyond. Let your voices be heard while the CDL's listening. And hopefully it's a good weekend of matches, and we'll be back on Sunday to break it all down for you guys. So see you then. Remember to send the chow.